The Mafia boss came home before sunset, and the first person waiting for him was not his fiancée. Not his driver, not one of the men at the gate. It was the maid's little boy, sitting cross-legged beneath the grand staircase with blue modeling clay all over his hands. The child looked up, saw Matteo De Santis, and did something no adult in that house ever did. He beckoned him closer, then he held up the clay. Pressed into the middle of it was the exact shape of an old iron key. "I made yours too, Mr. Teo," the boy whispered. The pretty lady said I mustn't tell. Matteo went still. Because there was only one iron key in the villa that mattered. It was older than the chandeliers, older than the marble staircase. Older than the business empire, the newspapers described with careful words and frightened commas. It opened the locked family chapel at the back of the estate. And behind the altar of that chapel, hidden inside the stone, sat a red leather ledger containing names. Routes, debts, judges, dock foremen, shell companies. And enough buried history to ruin half the port of Palermo. And now the maid's 4-year-old son was holding its shape in a lump of blue clay as casually as if he were showing off a toy. Rocca Bianca stood above the sea on the western ridge like a place built for weather and suspicion. The walls were pale limestone, the shutters were black. The front gate opened only after 2 cameras and 1 human voice had decided it should. There were 12 bedrooms in the main house. A formal dining room no one truly enjoyed, a library no one read in except Matteo. And a private chapel his father had locked for the last time on the winter evening before he was shot. Nothing on that estate happened by accident. Not the menu, not the schedule, not the silence at 39. Matteo De Santis had the kind of face that made people lower their voices. He was not large in the theatrical way films like to imagine powerful men. He was lean, almost severe, with black hair cut close. A scar near the right side of his chin, and the stillness of a man who had trained himself never to waste motion where observation would do more. He had inherited the De Santis organization at 26 after his father died between a courthouse wall and a black sedan. 3 bullets through a wool coat that had cost too much to bury. In 13 years, Matteo had rebuilt what others expected to collapse. On paper, the De Santis family handled shipping logistics, warehouse leasing, cold chain freight, and coastal transport. In practice, 3 harbor unions, 2 customs offices, several trucking contracts, and a long corridor of men who smiled in public and lied in private moved carefully when Matteo's name entered a room. He trusted little, he forgave less. He had one private rule he obeyed more faithfully than the law. More faithfully than Sunday Mass, more faithfully than sleep itself. If anyone ever asked too often about doors, codes, schedules, or ledgers, that person was already standing too close to betrayal. There was a wedding planned in 7 weeks, Lucia Belandi, daughter of a Calabrian-connected family with quiet money and louder ambitions, had been living at Rocca Bianca for nearly 3 months. She was 32, elegant without effort, never raised her voice, and wore perfume that arrived half a second before she did. On the surface, the marriage made perfect sense. A strategic alliance disguised as romance had solved worse problems than love ever had. In the underworld of southern Italy, blood ties and marriage ties had always done work guns could not finish. A wedding could end a feud, a daughter could seal an arrangement. A table set with crystal and flowers could hide the arithmetic of power. Lucia understood that arithmetic well, so did Niccolo Veri. Niccolo had been beside Matteo for 11 years, not family by blood, but close enough that other men had stopped making the distinction. He had carried messages when Matteo was still rebuilding. He had slept in warehouses, sat outside meetings, taken knives out of other men's hands, and once driven 6 straight hours with a broken wrist because Matteo had needed to get out of Naples without anyone knowing which road he had taken. He was the sort of man who remembered everyone's birthday and nobody's weakness unless he intended to use it later. Matteo had never caught him in a lie. That was what made him dangerous, behind the main villa. Past the citrus walk and the low wall that divided family rooms from workrooms, there was a smaller building the staff called the Linen House. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 above, a narrow kitchen. white curtains, old tile, and a courtyard where sheets lifted in the sea wind like surrender flags. Elena Moretti lived there with her son. Paolo. Elena was 29, dark-haired, quiet and precise. Her husband had been a crane mechanic at the docks before a snapped cable sent 3 tons of steel in the wrong direction and ended his life in under 4 seconds. The compensation case had dragged for 11 months and resolved into an amount too small to insult properly. Debt remained, rent remained, groceries remained. Grief remained longest of all. She had taken work at Rocca Bianca because the wages were double what hotel housekeeping paid and because Matteo had done one unusual thing when he interviewed her. He had looked at Paolo, not her. The child had been sitting on a leather chair much too large for him, holding a biscuit in both hands and staring at the chandelier like it might begin speaking any second. "Does he wander?" Matteo had asked. Elena had answered honestly. "Only toward things that interest him." Matteo had signed the employment papers. Paolo was 4 years old and built almost entirely of curiosity. He had soft brown hair that refused obedience, large serious eyes, and a habit of collecting objects adults ignored: buttons, bottle caps, smooth stones, screws, ribbons, corks, bits of colored glass. Anything small enough to fit in his pocket and mysterious enough to deserve ownership. He carried a stuffed fox missing one whisker. He called it Mayor because once, when Elena had asked him why, he had replied, "Because he knows everything." No one at Rocca Bianca was ever fully relaxed around Matteo De Santis. Gardeners straightened when he crossed the courtyard. Drivers stepped aside in hallways. Kitchen staff lowered their voices without realizing they were doing it. Even Niccolo, who drank grappa with him at 1 in the morning and had permission to enter the study without knocking, maintained a certain carefulness in front of others. Paolo was the exception. Children that age do not understand hierarchy. They understand faces, tone, routine, warmth. And whether a room feels dangerous, they notice color and sequence before they notice politics. They are often unreliable about motives and very reliable about objects. A 4-year-old may not grasp betrayal, but he can tell you exactly who held the gold lighter, who wore the red scarf, and which hand opened the drawer. Paolo had decided within 2 weeks that Matteo was not frightening, merely sad. The first thing he ever left on Matteo's desk was a lemon leaf. The second was a bottle cap he had polished on his shirt until it shone. The third was a drawing that was supposed to be a horse and looked more like a weather event. Elena had been mortified. Matteo had said only, "Leave it." Lucia had not liked that at all. She had once stopped in the hall, watched Paolo run barefoot past the music room with Mayor under one arm, and asked in her beautiful quiet voice why staff children were permitted in the main house. "Because he is 4, Matteo had answered. She had smiled, but not with her eyes. In the weeks that followed, 3 things happened that Matteo stored away without comment. The first was the chapel key. He kept it in the inner compartment of his study desk, wrapped in a square of black cloth. It was iron, hand-forged, heavy in the palm, marked near the bow with a tiny etched saint. He checked its position by touch, not sight, every Sunday morning 2 Sundays ago. It had been turned a few degrees from where he always left it. The second was the smell of beeswax in the morning room on a Tuesday when no candles had been used there. The third was Lucia herself, twice in 1 week. She had asked whether the old chapel would be reopened for the wedding photographs. Once over dinner, once while choosing flowers. The question had been casual both times, too casual. Matteo had not answered either question fully. Then came Thursday, at 2 in the afternoon. Matteo was meant to be in Trapani for a meeting with a freight broker and a customs intermediary, who was about to become much richer or much more frightened depending on how the afternoon went. Instead, a brake line failure on the broker's car sent him to a hospital outside Marsala. The meeting collapsed, and Matteo found himself driving home alone an hour earlier than anyone at Rocca Bianca expected. He entered through the side hall. No one heard him. The marble floors in the old part of the house had been restored with that in mind. His shoes made almost no sound. Afternoon light fell through the tall windows in pale gold rectangles. Somewhere far away a radio murmured from the service kitchen. The air smelled faintly of furniture polish and lemons. Then he saw Paolo beneath the staircase. Blue modeling clay. 2 small hands, one secret too large for the room. Matteo lowered himself into a crouch, his suit jacket opening slightly at the chest. Paolo looked from the clay to Matteo and then back again as if measuring whether adults could be trusted with art. "What is that?" Matteo asked softly. Paolo leaned close enough that Matteo could smell biscuit crumbs and soap. "A key," he whispered. "I made it after them." "After who?" "The pretty lady and Uncle Nino." Matteo did not move. Niccolo was the only person in the household Paolo called Uncle Nino. "When?" "This morning, in the yellow room." Paolo pointed toward the south morning room with one clay-covered finger. "They had a spoon and a little fire and the old key from your dark drawer." The blood in Matteo's body seemed to change temperature without changing pace. "What did they do with the key?" Paolo frowned in concentration, then spoke in the exact fragments of truth that small children give when nobody has yet taught them how adults prefer lies shaped. "They pressed it in the soft thing. Then the lady said hurry. Then Uncle Nino said tonight is better because you go to the city. Then she said not chapel now, chapel after 10. Then she saw me in the door and gave me a chocolate and said this is our game." Matteo held out his hand. "May I see?" Paolo placed the clay in his palm. The impression was unmistakable. Too deep to be an accident. Too precise to be imagination. "What color was the soft thing?" Matteo asked. "Gray first, then blue because I asked for blue." "What did Uncle Nino use for fire?" Paolo brightened. This part he knew. The shiny gold click-click. A lighter. "Did they say anything else?" Paolo considered. "The lady said after the wedding. No more locked rooms." Matteo closed his fingers very gently around the clay. He had spent most of his adult life reading men who lied for a living. He knew the difference between panic and performance. Between greed and fear, between a rehearsed answer and an accidental truth. He also knew that a child of 4 can invent a dragon, a pirate, or a moon made of cheese. But rarely invents beeswax, a gold lighter, a gray mold. And the exact promise of a room opening after 10, Matteo rose without haste. "Paolo," he said, "where is your mother?" "In the laundry room, she's ironing the pillow shirts." Matteo almost smiled. Pillow shirts. The child meant pillowcases. He extended one finger. "This is important. You are going to do something clever for me now." Paolo nodded at once. "You will take Mayor and go to your mother. You will stay with her until she says otherwise, and you will tell no one about this clay. Not Miss Lucia, not Uncle Nino, not anyone. Can you do that?" Paolo drew his small shoulders back the way children do when responsibility feels like a costume they are proud to wear. "Yes." Then he paused, looked up, and asked the question that shifted something small and unexpected inside Matteo DeSantis. "Are you the one in trouble?" Matteo looked at him for 1 second too long, then he answered honestly. "Not if you have told me in time." Within 12 minutes, Rocca Bianca had changed shape. Though from the outside nothing in the world appeared different. Elena was sent, under the pretext of inventory work, to the old gardener's cottage on the far edge of the grounds with Paolo and enough food for the evening. She understood from Matteo's face that the instruction was not casual. She asked no foolish questions. In houses built on omerta, survival often depended on recognizing the difference between silence chosen by fear and silence chosen by intelligence. Vittorio Serra, the head of security, arrived through the rear gate at 5:10. Vittorio was 56, square-shouldered, with short silver hair and the kind of expression that gave nothing away because it had long ago stopped trying. Before Rocca Bianca, he had spent years in army logistics, where he learned that most disasters are not born from explosions but from assumptions. Matteo trusted him because Vittorio disliked improvisation and had no appetite for gossip. In the locked study, Matteo set the blue clay on the desk between them. He told him everything, not with drama, not with outrage, with sequence. The early return, the child, the gray mold, the gold lighter, the line about after 10. The old chapel, the wedding. Vittorio listened. Then asked the only useful question. What matters more? Catching them inside the chapel or following what they take out? Both, Matteo said. For the next 4 hours. The estate became a machine working beneath velvet. The real red ledger was removed from the chapel and replaced with a copy Matteo had prepared for an emergency that, until that afternoon, he had half believed would never come. The false ledger looked old because parts of it were old. It contained real names mixed with dead roots, closed accounts, and one invented offshore channel leading to a refrigerated warehouse outside Mazzara del Vallo. Inside that false channel was a trap, 3 passports and false identities, 2 transfer schedules, 1 meeting point. Enough bait to pull out whoever stood beyond Lucia and Niccolo. A camera no larger than a shirt button was set inside the brass candle stand to the right of the altar. A second microphone was fixed behind the carved wood of the confessional grate. The outer desk drawer in Matteo's study was left visibly unsecured. The inner one, where the chapel key normally slept, remained exactly where Niccolo expected it to be. Except the cloth was different, the angle slightly altered, and the key itself replaced by a twin Matteo had commissioned years earlier for reasons he had never needed until now. At dinner, Matteo was perfect. Lucia wore black silk, and asked whether he was tired. Niccolo poured wine and discussed a warehouse lease renewal near the North Harbor. Matteo answered in the same measured tone he had used for months. He even asked Lucia whether the florist had confirmed the white roses for the chapel steps. She smiled. Yes. He watched her lift the glass to her mouth. Not her hand, her eyes. People reveal themselves in the half-second after they believe the performance is going well. At 10:43 that night, Lucia left the upstairs sitting room and said she had a headache at 10:49. Niccolo told the guard on West Corridor duty that Matteo was not to be disturbed while working. At 11:07, the camera in the chapel activated Matteo Vittorio, and 2 loyal men watched from the hidden security room beneath the archive stairs. Lucia entered first. She had changed into a dark wool dress and tied her hair back. Niccolo followed 30 seconds later in gloves. He closed the chapel door behind them. No hesitation, no prayer, no reverence. Lucia walked straight to the altar rail, as if she had been measuring the distance in her head for weeks. Niccolo produced the Coppa key. It slid in smoothly. Paolo's clay had been accurate. The stone panel behind the altar opened. Lucia reached in, her hands did not shake. She drew out the false ledger, the passports, and the sealed envelope Matteo had placed on top like a gift for traitors. Then she laughed once under her breath. A very small sound, not joy, relief. Niccolo lifted his phone. What he said next explained more than Matteo had expected and much less than he deserved. It's there, Niccolo murmured. Everything. We meet the Calvani people at the cannery after midnight tomorrow, and after the wedding. The old man signs the merger before he signs anything else. Lucia turned sharply. Not after, before. I am not standing beside him at that altar if there is any risk. Niccolo gave her a look Matteo had never seen before on his face, irritation stripped of charm. You'll stand where I tell you, he trusts you now. That was the entire point. Lucia's expression changed. Not with guilt, with injury. What do you mean the point? Niccolo looked away from the altar toward the candlelight. Impatient with her in the way men become impatient with women they have already used. The point, he said, was access. Matteo felt something cold settle more deeply inside him. Lucia took one step toward Niccolo. And Barcelona? Niccolo actually smiled. Lucia, let us survive Sunday before we spend Monday in Spain. He kissed her once. Quickly, with no tenderness in it at all. And the sound of that kiss in the chapel where Matteo's mother had once knelt as a girl was uglier than any curse. But the true poison came 10 seconds later. Lucia touched the false passports and asked quietly, And him? Niccolo replied, The mountain road after the registry office would have been easiest. But now that we have the ledger, it may not matter. The room did not move. The candle flame flickered once and steadied. Matteo remained absolutely still. Rage is loud. Calculation is quieter and far more expensive. By morning the plan was no longer theirs. It was his. The abandoned tuna cannery lay north of the old salt flats, a place with rusted catwalks, broken windows, gulls nesting in rafters, and the smell of sea metal that never quite left her clothes. Once, 30 years earlier, it had packed fish for half the coast. Now it stood empty except for teenagers in summer and men, who preferred illegal meetings in buildings everyone else had stopped respecting. Matteo let the handoff proceed. That was important. If he snatched the false ledger too early, he gained 2 traitors. If he followed it to the end, he gained the network behind them. So, on Friday night at 12:40, Lucia and Niccolo left Rocca Bianca separately. She took the smaller car. He took the black SUV he used for ordinary business. Matteo did not stop either of them. At 1:18, they reached the cannery. Waiting inside were 3 men from the Calvani side of the port war. One accountant whose hands had never carried anything heavier than a pen, and a broker who had changed loyalties so many times he had begun to think that made him clever rather than temporary. They opened the false ledger under a hanging work light. Names, routes, account numbers, signatures. Enough truth mixed with lies to feel real. What happened next lasted less than 4 minutes. The exterior lights came on all at once. 2 roads out were blocked by trucks that appeared empty until the doors opened. Financial police moved in from the east fence. Vittorio's men sealed the seaward side. Nobody fired because nobody had time to decide which betrayal had just betrayed which. The accountant raised his hands first. The broker tried to run and discovered the salt mud did not care for Italian leather. One Cavani man reached for a weapon and found Vittorio standing behind him. Before his fingers reached the grip, Lucia went pale, then gray. Niccolo turned in a full circle as if the missing path out might materialize if he looked hard enough. Then Matteo stepped from the shadow of the loading bay. Long black coat, no hurry. No weapon in his hands when Niccolo saw him. The arrogance went out of his face like electricity cut from a room. For a moment no one spoke, then Matteo said very quietly, "You should have chosen someone other than a child for your audience." Niccolo's eyes shifted once toward Lucia, once toward the false ledger, once toward the road, mathematics. Always too late in men like him. He tried the oldest lie first. "Matteo, listen to me." "No," Matteo said. "You have had 11 years of that privilege." Lucia stared between them, understanding at last that there would be no partnership. No escape, no clean future waiting in Barcelona or anywhere else. Only evidence, only exposure, only the sudden knowledge that the man beside her had treated her as a key, then a corridor, then an inconvenience. "You told me," she began. Niccolo snapped back. "Not now." Those 2 words did more damage to her than the arrests. Matteo watched her face change, not because he enjoyed it. Because truth, when it finally arrives, deserves witnesses. He stepped closer to Niccolo. "I buried my father with you standing at my left shoulder," Matteo said. "When I had no one I could name brother without lying to myself, I named you. I gave you my table, my codes, my trust and entry into my house. And you let a copied key tell me who you were." Niccolo's mouth tightened. He tried for pride. Men do that when fear feels too naked. "You were growing soft," he said. "Marriage, gardens, chapel flowers. You were forgetting what keeps men like us alive." Matteo looked at him for a long second. "No," he said. "I was remembering it." Vittorio stepped in then. No theatrics, no beating, no wasted shouting. Niccolo was disarmed, cuffed and placed in the back of a vehicle with the efficient dignity of a man being delivered to consequences he had mistaken for unlikely. Lucia did not resist either. She simply stood there in the hard white glare of the work light, staring at Niccolo as though some last part of her still expected him to turn back and rescue her from the truth of him. He did not by dawn. The De Santis problem had become a Belandi problem, a Calvani problem, and for 3 lesser men, a prison problem. Matteo sent the recordings, the copied messages, the chapel footage, and one final note to Lucia's father before noon. No insults, no threats, only evidence in certain worlds. Evidence is a more elegant insult than bullets will ever be. Lucia was removed from Rocca Bianca before sunset. No wedding announcement was ever revised, because none had yet been publicly printed. By the following week, her name vanished from conversation in the way inconvenient names vanish around old money and organized fear. Niccolo did not vanish. Matteo chose something harsher. He delivered him alive into formal custody through a chain of arrangements that stripped him of usefulness to everyone at once. No romance, no martyrdom, no legend. Just fluorescent lights, concrete, paperwork. And a future in which his memory would matter less each month. Rocca Bianca grew quieter after that. Not peaceful, not yet, just quieter on Sunday afternoon. Matteo walked to the gardener's cottage himself. Elena opened the door with Paola on her hip and fear still hidden badly at the edges of her face. Matteo had sent guards, money, food, and reassurances. But women who have buried husbands do not mistake quiet for safety until enough time has passed to prove it. "It is over," Matteo said. Elena searched his expression and believed him not because he was powerful, but because he looked tired in a way dishonest men rarely allow themselves to look. Paolo saw him and wriggled down at once. "Did the bad game stop?" he asked. Matteo crouched. "Yes," Paolo nodded, satisfied by the economy of that answer, then disappeared into the next room and returned with something held carefully in both hands. It was another lump of clay, this time painted with gold watercolor from a child's craft set. "I made you a safe key," he said proudly. "This one opens only good doors." Matteo took it as if it were fragile glass. For several seconds he did not speak. Elena, standing in the doorway with one hand still on the frame, watched something pass across his face that had no place in business meetings. Warehouse arguments or midnight negotiations, pain perhaps. Or the first outline of relief that week, the chapel at Rocca Bianca was opened in daylight for the first time in years. The red ledger was moved to a safer place no one in the house would ever know. The hidden compartment behind the altar was sealed with stone and mortar. The brass stand that had held the tiny camera was polished and returned to what it had once pretended to be. Matteo had the old pews repaired. He had the shutters opened. He removed 2 boxes of old files from the side sacristy and replaced them with fresh candles and vases of white lily. Vittorio asked once whether it was wise to make the room ordinary again. Matteo answered, "It should never have become what it became." 3 weeks later, Elena came to Matteo's study after dinner and told him she intended to leave the estate. Not because she was ungrateful, because Paolo was starting to love the place. And she had no wish to raise a child inside a world that solved every problem by locking it in a hidden room. Matteo listened without interruption. Then he did something few men with power know how to do. He did not stop her. He arranged an apartment over a bakery near Via Caldera under Elena's name. Paid 6 months in advance through a channel clean enough not to insult her dignity. And told her she could keep working at Rocca Bianca only if she wished. She kept the job. She kept the boundaries too. She and Paolo slept in the city. The child came to the estate only on Sundays. At first Matteo saw them less, then somehow more. Because Sunday acquired shape, he began driving in himself to collect them. No convoy, no second car, just Matteo, the dark sedan. And Paolo in the back seat explaining with grave seriousness why clouds looked heavier over the port than over the hills. Elena would sit beside him, one hand folded in her lap, the other resting near Paolo's fox when the child fell asleep on the drive back. Dinner moved, gradually and without announcement, from the formal room to the service kitchen 1 night a week, then 2, then nearly always. Paolo liked to sit on the counter and narrate events nobody else had seen. The tomato sauce bubbling too loudly, the spoon being brave, the bread getting nervous in the oven. Matteo, who once reduced grown men to silence with a glance, learned to answer such reports with full seriousness. Elena laughed more after that. Not often, but enough. Winter went, spring arrived. The harbor business changed with it. Matteo cut ties with the dirtiest freight routes, closed 2 shell companies, handed day-to-day muscle to men who preferred numbers over violence and procedures over pride. He did not become a saint. Men like Matteo do not cross one clean line and emerge innocent on the far side. But he became selective in a way his father never had. He began dismantling the parts of his own life that required too much darkness to maintain. One Sunday in May, Paulo ran into the reopened chapel carrying Mayer under one arm and stopped dead in the center aisle. The room no longer smelled of dust and secrets. It smelled of wax and fresh flowers. "Where is the bad wall?" he asked. "Gone," Matteo said. Paulo considered that, then nodded as if good architecture had finally corrected a moral flaw. "Good," he replied. "Churches shouldn't hide ugly things." Elena looked down at the floor when he said it. Matteo looked at the altar. Children rarely know when they are delivering judgment. That is one reason it lands so cleanly by June. Rocca Bianca had jasmine where the thorn hedges used to be. By August, Matteo had forgotten what dinner in the formal room tasted like. By October, Paulo had stopped calling him Mr. Teo every time and started saying it only when he wanted to be especially persuasive. There was no grand proposal, no orchestrated spectacle, no ring delivered on a violin pillow or beneath fireworks over the sea. One evening in late autumn, Elena was standing in the kitchen doorway dusted lightly with flour. Paulo asleep on the sofa with Mayer under his chin. When Matteo looked at the two of them in the yellow lamplight and said, with the same directness he had once used to negotiate cargo terms, "If there is ever a place in your life for me that is not temporary, I would like to stand in it," Elena stared at him for several seconds. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Would you know how to protect peace once you had it?" Matteo answered, "I would know better than to hide poison behind an altar." It was not poetry. It was honest for her, that was enough. They married the following spring in the little chapel that no longer contained ledgers. False walls or traps, only candles, lily, open shutters. And a child in a navy jacket carrying the ring so carefully with both hands that one would have thought Europe depended on his balance. When the vows were done and the signatures written, Paulo looked up at Matteo with the solemn authority of a boy who had once ended a conspiracy with blue clay. "So now," he asked, "do I still need to say mister?" The adults laughed, all of them, even Vittorio, who claimed later that he had not. Matteo bent down to his height. "No," he said. And Paulo, pleased that the world had finally become properly organized, threw both arms around his neck. Years later, men in Palermo still spoke Matteo de Santis's name with caution, at the port. His reputation remained what reputations become when they survive bullets, betrayals and time, but inside Rocca Bianca, the study desk no longer held only sealed files and hard decisions. There was also a gold-painted clay key in a glass case, a photograph taken outside the chapel in spring light, and a child's drawing of a white house with many windows and a man standing beside it who had been given an enormous smile. Sometimes the thing that saves a powerful man is not another powerful man. Not a gun, not a lawyer, not a secret account. Sometimes it is a child too young to understand treachery, and therefore too innocent to participate in it. A child who notices the blue clay, the gold lighter, the copied key, and the strange sentence adults think will disappear if spoken softly enough. Power can buy guards, it can buy gates, it can buy silence. But it cannot buy the kind of truth that walks up to you with clay on its fingers and says, "Very simply, I made yours too. If you were Matteo, would you have exploded the moment you understood what was happening? Or would you have stayed quiet long enough to see the whole betrayal through?" And in your own life, has someone small, honest, and unexpected ever shown you the truth before everyone else did? Tell us in the comments. If this story stayed with you even for a moment, leave a like. Share it with someone who still believes innocence can change a life. And subscribe for more stories that remind us that sometimes the purest heart in the room sees what the smartest adults miss.